The peaceful Sunday afternoon shattered with the sound of a child's scream. In the Thompson family's small but tidy kitchen, 8-year-old Jamal had been trying to help his father Marcus prepare lunch. It was their special weekend tradition, father and son cooking together while listening to old jazz records. Marcus had only turned away for 30 seconds to answer a phone call from his sister. That's all it took for disaster to strike. Jamal, eager to prove he could make his own grilled cheese sandwich, had climbed onto a chair to reach the stove. His sleeve caught fire when it touched the hot burner. "Daddy, help." Jamal's terrified voice made Marcus drop his phone instantly. The next few moments played out like a slow-motion nightmare. Marcus saw his son frantically waving his arm, the flames climbing up the cotton sleeve of his favorite Spider-Man shirt. Without hesitation, Marcus grabbed the kitchen fire blanket they kept mounted on the wall, a safety measure he had always hoped never to use. "Stay still, buddy. Don't move." Marcus's voice remained steady despite his racing heart. He wrapped the blanket around Jamal's arm, smothering the flames in seconds. But the damage was already done. Angry red burns covered Jamal's right arm from his wrist to his elbow. Their next-door neighbor, Mrs. Robinson, heard the commotion and rushed over. The 65-year-old retired nurse took one look at Jamal's arm and knew this was serious. "This needs immediate medical attention," she said firmly, already grabbing her car keys. "I'm driving you to Memorial Hospital. It's only 8 minutes away if we take Oak Street." Marcus scooped up his whimpering son, grateful for Mrs. Robinson's quick thinking. In emergencies, she always knew exactly what to do. She had lived next door since before Jamal was born and had become like a grandmother to the boy. The drive to Memorial Hospital was the longest 8 minutes of Marcus's life. Every red light felt like an eternity. Every bump in the road made Jamal wince, sending daggers through his father's heart. Mrs. Robinson drove as fast as she safely could, her old Toyota Camry weaving through Sunday traffic with surprising skill. "It hurts, Daddy," Jamal whispered, his usual cheerful voice now small and frightened. Tears rolled down his brown cheeks, but he was trying so hard to be brave. "I know, son. We're almost there," Marcus soothed, holding his boy close in the back seat. He kept talking softly, trying to distract Jamal from the pain. "Remember what you learned about burns in your science class last week? Your teacher, Mrs. Hayes, would be proud of how brave you're being right now." The car pulled up to Memorial Hospital's emergency entrance at 2:47 p.m. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh as Marcus carried Jamal inside. The emergency room was surprisingly quiet for a Sunday afternoon. Only a few people sat in the waiting area, an elderly man reading a magazine, a woman with a sleeping toddler, and a teenager holding an ice pack to his ankle. Mrs. Robinson immediately approached the front desk, her voice carrying the authority of her 40 years of nursing experience. "This child has second-degree burns on his right arm. He needs immediate treatment." The young receptionist, whose name tag read Jenny, quickly began entering information into her computer. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she asked Marcus for basic details: Jamal's name, age, any allergies to medications. Through it all, Jamal stayed curled against his father's chest, his small body trembling slightly. The burn on his arm looked worse under the bright hospital lights. The skin was an angry red, with several blisters already forming. Marcus could feel his son's rapid heartbeat against his chest. "Just hold on a little longer, champ," Marcus whispered, gently rubbing Jamal's back. "The doctors will help make it better soon." Mrs. Robinson stood beside them, her hand resting supportively on Marcus's shoulder. She had grabbed Jamal's medical history folder from their house before leaving, the one she'd always reminded Marcus to keep updated. Now she handed it to the receptionist, who nodded gratefully. None of them knew that in the next few minutes, their simple emergency room visit would turn into something much more complicated. As they waited for the doctor to arrive, Marcus had no idea that his son's injury would expose an ugly truth about prejudice in healthcare, or that his response to it would lead to significant changes in the entire hospital system. For now, he simply held his son, whispering words of comfort and watching the treatment room doors, waiting for them to open. After 15 minutes of waiting, Nurse Sarah Chen hurried into the reception area. She was young, probably in her late 20s, with her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. One look at Jamal's burned arm made her eyes widen with concern. "Please come with me right away," she said, leading them to treatment room 3. The small room was bright and clean, with medical charts on the walls and a large examination bed covered in white paper. Mrs. Robinson waited outside, giving the family space but staying close by. Nurse Chen gently helped Jamal onto the bed while Marcus held his hand. She quickly checked Jamal's vital signs: temperature, pulse, and blood pressure. Her movements were efficient but gentle, earning a tiny smile from the scared boy. "Dr. Richards will be here shortly," she assured them, carefully documenting Jamal's condition in the medical chart. "I'll start preparing what we need for burn treatment." 5 minutes later, Dr. Victor Richards walked in. He was a tall man in his 50s, wearing an expensive-looking watch and perfectly pressed scrubs. Instead of looking at Jamal or greeting the family, he picked up the chart and frowned. "How did this happen?" he asked, still not looking up. Marcus explained about the kitchen accident, his voice tight with worry. "Please, his arm is really hurting him." Dr. Richards finally glanced at Jamal, but his eyes quickly shifted away. He took 2 steps backward, staying near the door. The burn unit at Central Hospital would be better equipped to handle this case. Nurse Chen's head snapped up in surprise. "Dr. Richards, we have everything we need right here. The burn isn't severe enough to require transfer, and the child is in pain." "I make the decisions about patient care, Nurse Chen," Dr. Richards said coldly. "And I'm saying they should go to Central." Marcus stood up straighter, still holding Jamal's hand. "Central Hospital is 45 minutes away. My son needs help now." "Well, perhaps if you had been watching him more carefully, we wouldn't be having this problem," Dr. Richards replied with a sneer. "Some people just aren't prepared for the responsibilities of." He didn't finish his sentence, but his meaning was clear. The room fell silent. Even 8-year-old Jamal could feel the tension in the air. Nurse Chen's face had gone pale with anger. "I need to check on another patient," Dr. Richards announced, turning to leave. "The front desk can give you directions to Central." As he walked out, he bumped into Dr. Patricia Washington, who was just coming on duty. She was an experienced emergency doctor who had worked at Memorial for 15 years. "What's going on here?" Dr. Washington asked, noting the tension in the room and the tears on Jamal's face. Before anyone could answer, they'd all heard Dr. Richards muttering to another doctor in the hallway. His voice was low, but his words were clear enough. "Those people need to learn to go to their own hospitals. I'm not wasting my time when I have real patients waiting." Marcus's hands shook with anger. Mrs. Robinson, who had been watching through the door window, burst into the room. "I heard every word that man said. I worked as a nurse for 40 years, and I have never seen such disgusting behavior from a doctor." Dr. Washington's expression hardened as she understood the situation. She walked to Jamal's bedside and spoke directly to him with a warm smile. "Hi there, young man. I'm Dr. Washington, and I'm going to take good care of you. Can you be brave for me while I look at your arm?" Jamal nodded, relief showing on his face as someone finally seemed ready to help him. Nurse Chen was already documenting everything in detail: the time, Dr. Richards's exact words, and his refusal to treat a patient in obvious pain. Her hands moved quickly across the keyboard of the room's computer, recording every detail of what had just happened. "Mr. Thompson," she said quietly to Marcus, "I want you to know I'm filing an official incident report about Dr. Richards's behavior. This is completely unacceptable." Marcus nodded, his lawyer's mind already working through what needed to be done. But for now, his only concern was his son. He watched as Dr. Washington and Nurse Chen began treating Jamal's burns with gentle, skilled hands. Outside in the hallway, they could hear Dr. Richards's voice fading away as he walked to another part of the emergency room, unaware that his actions in the last few minutes would soon lead to consequences he never expected. While Dr. Washington worked on treating Jamal's burns, Marcus stepped into the hallway to make a quick phone call to his sister about watching Jamal's younger brother. That's when he overheard more of Dr. Richards's true nature, in a conversation that would change everything. Dr. Richards stood near the nurse's station with another doctor, thinking no one could hear them. He was complaining loudly about his day, unaware that Marcus was just around the corner. "This is exactly why I hate working Sunday shifts in this neighborhood," Dr. Richards grumbled to his colleague. "They all come rushing in here like everything's an emergency. Did you see that black kid with the burn? Probably playing with matches or something. And of course, they don't have proper insurance." Marcus froze in place. His phone call forgotten, he pressed his back against the wall, listening as his worst fears were confirmed. He had suspected the reason for Dr. Richards's behavior, but hearing it stated so boldly made his stomach turn. "You can't say things like that," the other doctor whispered, sounding uncomfortable. "Someone might hear you." Dr. Richards laughed. "Oh, please, I've been doing this for 20 years. You know how many complaints these people have filed against me? 0, because they know their place. They'll just go to Central Hospital like I told them to." Marcus's hands tightened into fists. As a civil rights attorney, he had handled dozens of discrimination cases, but this was different. This wasn't just about him. It was about his 8-year-old son, who was in pain and needed help. It was about every other family that Dr. Richards might have turned away before. He pulled out his phone again, but this time he wasn't calling his sister. He opened the voice recorder app and pressed record, making sure to capture Dr. Richards's continuing rant. "I'm telling you, this neighborhood used to be different," Dr. Richards went on. "Now they all think they can come to our hospital instead of going where they belong. That father probably doesn't even have a job." The irony of that statement would have made Marcus laugh if he wasn't so angry. He had spent the last 15 years building one of the most successful civil rights law practices in the city. He had argued cases before the state Supreme Court. And here was Dr. Richards, making assumptions based on nothing but the color of his skin. Back in treatment room 3, Jamal was doing better. Dr. Washington had given him pain medication and was carefully cleaning and dressing his burns. Nurse Chen stayed in the room, providing comfort and assistance while also quietly documenting everything in the hospital's computer system. Marcus returned to the room, his face tight with controlled anger. Mrs. Robinson, who knew him well enough to read his expression, placed a gentle hand on his arm. "What did you hear?" she asked softly. Marcus shook his head, not wanting to discuss it in front of Jamal, but he pulled out his phone and typed a quick message, showing it to Mrs. Robinson, recording everything. "This ends today." She nodded firmly, her own expression hardening. In her 40 years as a nurse, she had seen too many families face this kind of discrimination, but this time would be different. This time there was proof. Dr. Washington noticed the tension but kept her focus on Jamal. She was telling him a funny story about her own son, who had once tried to cook breakfast in bed for her birthday and ended up with pancake batter all over the kitchen ceiling. "How did he get it on the ceiling?" Jamal asked, giggling despite his pain. "That's what I asked him." Dr. Washington smiled, carefully applying the last piece of gauze. "He said he was trying to flip the pancake like they do on TV." Through the window, they could see Dr. Richards walking past, not even glancing into the room. He had no idea that his casual bigotry had been captured on Marcus's phone. He didn't know that Marcus had already sent the recording to his law office's secure server, or that years of discriminatory behavior were about to catch up with him. Marcus watched the doctor disappear down the hallway, then turned back to his son. Right now, Jamal's care was the priority. But soon, very soon, Dr. Richards would learn that he had picked the wrong family to discriminate against. The people he looked down on were about to teach him a powerful lesson about justice. Nurse Sarah Chen stood at her computer station, her hands shaking slightly as she typed. In her 3 years at Memorial Hospital, she had always tried to be professional and keep her head down. But what she had just witnessed made that impossible. "I can't let this continue," she whispered to herself, clicking open the hospital's incident reporting system. The bright screen reflected in her determined eyes as she began documenting everything she had seen. Down the hall, she could see Dr. Richards talking to another nurse, acting as if nothing was wrong, as if he hadn't just denied care to a burned child. Sarah's mind flashed back to her own childhood, when her Chinese immigrant parents had faced similar discrimination. They had taught her to stay quiet and work hard. But today, staying quiet felt like being part of the problem. With a deep breath, she pressed the urgent button on her report. This would send immediate notifications to hospital administrator Janet Morris and the chief of emergency medicine. Then she did something even braver. She walked straight up to Dr. Richards. "Dr. Richards, I need to speak with you privately," Sarah said, her voice stronger than she expected. He barely glanced at her. "I'm busy, Nurse Chen." "Then I'll speak right here," she replied. "What you did in there was wrong. It was unprofessional, unethical, and completely against hospital policy." Several nearby nurses stopped what they were doing, watching the scene unfold. Dr. Richards finally turned to face Sarah, his face red with anger. "Are you questioning my medical judgment?" he demanded. "I'm questioning your ethics," Sarah answered. "That child needed immediate treatment. You violated your oath as a doctor, and I've reported it to administration." Dr. Richards stepped closer, trying to intimidate her with his height. "You've worked here for what, 3 years? I've been here for 20. Who do you think they'll believe?" "They'll believe the truth," came a firm voice from behind them. Dr. Patricia Washington had stepped out of Jamal's room. "And they'll believe the security cameras that record everything in these halls, including your conversation about those people going to their own hospitals." Dr. Richards's face went pale. He hadn't realized the security cameras could pick up sound. At that moment, the elevator doors opened, and hospital administrator Janet Morris stepped out. She was a tall woman in her 60s with silver hair and a reputation for zero tolerance of discrimination. "Dr. Richards, my office, now," she said sharply. Then she turned to Sarah. "Nurse Chen, thank you for your immediate report. Please make sure all your documentation is complete. We'll need your statement." Sarah nodded, standing taller. "I have everything recorded in the system, including timestamps and exact quotes. I also have 3 witness statements from other staff members." Janet Morris nodded approvingly. "Dr. Washington, how is the patient?" "Jamal is receiving proper treatment now," Dr. Washington replied. "The burns are painful but not severe. He should recover fully with proper care." "And his father?" "Mr. Thompson is with him. He's been remarkably composed, considering the circumstances." Janet's expression hardened. "Dr. Richards, I'm still waiting. My office now." As Dr. Richards followed Janet to the elevator, Sarah returned to Jamal's room. Marcus looked up as she entered, and she could see the gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for doing the right thing." Sarah smiled, checking Jamal's bandages. The boy had finally fallen asleep, the pain medication doing its job. It's what anyone should have done. I just hope it helps make some changes around here. Mrs. Robinson, who was still sitting in the corner of the room, stood up and hugged Sarah. "In my 40 years of nursing, I've seen too many people look the other way. You didn't, and that takes real courage." Outside the room, they could hear the hospital starting to buzz with activity. More administrators were arriving, called in for an emergency meeting. Security guards were reviewing camera footage. Other nurses were coming forward with their own stories about Dr. Richards' past behavior. Sarah looked at sleeping Jamal, then at his father who sat protectively by his side. She thought about all the other families who might have faced similar discrimination but had no one to speak up for them. Today, that pattern had finally been broken. "Changes are coming," she said softly, straightening Jamal's blanket. "And they're long overdue." While Jamal slept peacefully in his hospital bed, Marcus Thompson sat in the corner of the room, his laptop open on the small side table. 15 years as a civil rights attorney had taught him that cases were won and lost based on documentation. Right now, while everything was fresh, he needed to record every detail. Mrs. Robinson had gone to get them all coffee, and Nurse Chen was handling other patients. The quiet beeping of Jamal's heart monitor created a steady rhythm as Marcus typed his detailed account of the day's events. 2:47 p.m., arrived at Memorial Hospital emergency room. 2:49 p.m., checked in with receptionist Jenny Martinez. 3:04 p.m., first contact with nurse Sarah Chen. 3:10 p.m., Dr. Richards enters room. Marcus paused his typing when his phone buzzed. It was Lisa, his law firm's senior paralegal. "I got your message," Lisa said urgently. "The voice recording is already saved on 3 separate secure servers. I've also requested the hospital's security footage for the entire afternoon through official channels." "Thank you, Lisa," Marcus replied quietly, not wanting to wake Jamal. "I need you to do one more thing. Check our case files from the last 5 years. Look for any complaints about Memorial Hospital, especially involving Dr. Richards." "Already on it," Lisa answered. "And Marcus, I found 3 similar complaints from other families. They didn't pursue legal action because they were afraid or didn't have proof. But they all mentioned Dr. Richards by name." Marcus's hands tightened on his phone. 3 other families. How many more had there been who never even reported it? Dr. Washington came in to check on Jamal's burns. She noticed Marcus working and handed him a sealed envelope. "My written statement," she said softly. "Everything I witnessed, including Dr. Richards's comments in the hallway. I've made 2 other copies, one for hospital administration and one for the state medical board." Marcus nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Dr. Washington. Not everyone would be willing to speak up against a colleague." "He's not a colleague," she replied firmly. "A true doctor doesn't refuse to treat a child because of race." She checked Jamal's bandages one more time before leaving. Marcus returned to his documentation. He opened his phone's photo gallery and began transferring pictures to his laptop. The initial injury, the emergency room waiting area showing several empty beds, the timestamps on hospital documents, the witness statements that were starting to pile up on his table. Mrs. Robinson returned with coffee and something else, a small notebook filled with her own detailed notes. 40 years of nursing taught me to write everything down," she explained, handing him the notebook. "Times, names, exact words used. I even drew a diagram of where everyone was standing when that horrible man refused to treat Jamal." Marcus added her notes to his growing file. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from the hospital's HR department, requesting an official statement. They were moving faster than he expected. Good. Nurse Chen stopped by during her rounds, carrying more papers. "These just came from the nursing staff," she said, placing them on his table. "Statements from 3 other nurses who witnessed Dr. Richards's behavior today, plus documentation of previous incidents they've observed. They were afraid to report them before, but not anymore." Marcus looked at the growing pile of evidence on his table. In just a few hours, the truth about Dr. Richards was coming to light from every direction. His laptop screen now showed multiple folders. Witness statements, photo evidence, audio recordings, hospital documents, previous complaints, timeline of events, staff testimonials. A soft noise made him look up. Jamal was stirring in his sleep, his small face peaceful now that the pain medication was working. Marcus walked over and gently adjusted his son's blanket. "We're going to make sure this never happens to another child," he whispered, touching Jamal's hand softly. Back at his laptop, Marcus began drafting the formal complaint he would file with the state medical board first thing tomorrow morning. Every fact was backed up by evidence. Every claim had multiple witnesses. Every detail was documented with timestamps and signatures. Dr. Richards had picked the wrong family to discriminate against. He hadn't just encountered an angry father, he had encountered a skilled civil rights attorney with the resources and knowledge to expose years of discriminatory behavior. And Marcus Thompson was just getting started. 3 days after the incident, Memorial Hospital's main conference room was packed with people. Hospital Administrator Janet Morris sat at the head of the table, surrounded by board members, legal representatives, and ethics committee officials. The thick folder in front of her contained Marcus Thompson's formal complaint, along with dozens of supporting documents. "In my 30 years of hospital administration," Janet began, her voice grave, "I have never seen such a thorough and well-documented complaint." On the screen behind her, security camera footage played silently, showing Dr. Richards turning away from Jamal's treatment room. The timestamp matched exactly with Marcus's audio recording, which they had just finished playing. Down the hall from this meeting, Dr. Richards sat in the HR office, his face pale as he read through the charges against him. His expensive watch tapped nervously against the desk as he realized how serious the situation had become. "This isn't just about Sunday's incident," the HR director explained. "Since Mr. Thompson filed his complaint, we've received 17 other reports of similar behavior from your past patients." The local news had picked up the story, though they hadn't named Jamal because he was a minor. The headline read, "Prestigious Hospital Investigates Doctor for Racial Discrimination." The story was spreading quickly through social media, with more families coming forward every day. At his law office, Marcus was interviewing another family, the Johnsons, whose teenage daughter had been turned away by Dr. Richards 6 months ago with a severe asthma attack. "We knew it was wrong," Mrs. Johnson said, wiping tears from her eyes, "but we didn't think anyone would believe us. When we saw your story on the news, my husband said we had to come forward." Lisa, Marcus's paralegal, was organizing the growing stack of testimonials. "That's the 5th family today," she said after the Johnsons left. And the hospital's internal investigation has uncovered 15 more cases. Back at Memorial Hospital, Nurse Sarah Chen was meeting with the ethics committee. Her clear, professional documentation of Sunday's events had opened the door for other staff members to speak up. It wasn't just patients, she explained to the committee. Dr. Richards regularly made racist comments in the break room. Many of us felt uncomfortable, but he was so senior that everyone was afraid to report him. The investigation was spreading beyond Memorial Hospital. The state medical board had launched their own review, requesting Dr. Richards' complete employment history from every hospital he had worked at over his 20-year career. "We're finding a pattern," one board member told Janet Morris over the phone. Similar complaints at 3 other hospitals. He would leave before any formal action was taken, and the hospitals, wanting to avoid controversy, didn't follow up. In the hospital cafeteria, other doctors and nurses were discussing the changes already taking place. New mandatory bias training had been scheduled. Anonymous reporting systems were being upgraded. The hospital was forming a diversity and inclusion committee. About time, Dr. Washington said during her lunch break. "One good thing about this awful situation, it's forcing everyone to face problems that have been ignored for too long." The local medical association called an emergency meeting. They had received calls from concerned hospitals across the state, all wanting to review their own policies and procedures. "The Thompson case is a wake-up call," the association president announced. "We need to ensure this never happens again at any medical facility." At home, Jamal was recovering well, his burns healing properly under Dr. Washington's care. He didn't know about all the changes his experience had sparked. He just knew that lots of people had visited their house to talk to his father, and that his dad spent a lot of time on the phone and computer. "Does your arm still hurt?" Marcus asked that evening, carefully applying the prescribed ointment to Jamal's healing burns. "Not much anymore," Jamal replied. "Dad, are you still mad at that mean doctor?" Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm not mad, son. I'm working to make sure he learns that what he did was wrong, and to protect other families from getting hurt." As if to emphasize his point, Marcus's phone buzzed with another message from the hospital board. They had scheduled an emergency hearing for Dr. Richards, and more families were asking to testify. The investigation was growing larger than anyone had expected, but for Marcus Thompson, it was exactly what he had hoped for: a chance to create real, lasting change in a system that had ignored discrimination for far too long. 1 week after the incident, Memorial Hospital's largest conference room was filled to capacity. The emergency board meeting had been called for 9:00 a.m., but people started arriving by 8:30. Hospital staff members lined the walls, and representatives from the state medical board occupied one entire side of the long table. Dr. Richards sat alone at one end, his usual confidence completely gone. His expensive watch, which he had always shown off proudly, now lay in his briefcase. Gone too was his arrogant smile, replaced by a look of growing fear as more people filed into the room. Janet Morris, a hospital administrator, called the meeting to order exactly at 9:00 a.m. The thick folder in front of her contained the results of their week-long investigation. "Dr. Victor Richards," she began, her voice clear and firm, "this board has reviewed extensive evidence regarding your conduct on Sunday and throughout your career at Memorial Hospital. The findings are deeply disturbing." She began reading from the report. 27 documented cases of discriminatory treatment, 15 formal complaints from hospital staff, 42 witness statements, multiple recordings of racist comments, evidence of falsified patient records. Dr. Richards tried to interrupt. "These accusations are..." "Silence," Janet cut him off. "You'll have your chance to speak, though I don't see how you can defend these actions." In the back of the room, Nurse Sarah Chen sat with several other nurses who had come forward. They watched as Janet continued listing the evidence they had helped gather. "Effective immediately," Janet announced, "Dr. Richards' employment at Memorial Hospital is terminated. We are also recommending that the state medical board revoke his medical license permanently." Dr. Richards jumped to his feet. "You can't do this. I've worked here for 20 years. 20 years of causing harm," the medical board representative responded. "We've uncovered similar patterns at your previous hospitals. You've been running from consequences for your entire career, Dr. Richards. That ends today." Security guards stepped forward as Dr. Richards began shouting about lawsuits and his perfect record. They escorted him from the room, his protests echoing down the hallway. But the meeting wasn't over. Janet Morris turned to the second page of her report. "This incident has exposed serious flaws in our hospital systems," she acknowledged. "Starting today, we are implementing the following changes: mandatory bias training for all staff, conducted by external experts; new anonymous reporting system for patients and staff; creation of a diversity and inclusion board; regular reviews of patient treatment statistics; installation of additional security cameras with audio recording; updated emergency room protocols requiring 2 doctors to sign off on any patient transfer; monthly staff meetings to discuss workplace culture." In her office across town, Lisa, Marcus's paralegal, was organizing the civil lawsuits filed by other families who had faced discrimination from Dr. Richards. 23 families had come forward so far. The hospital's insurance company called, she told Marcus over the phone. They want to settle all cases and set up a compensation fund for any other victims who come forward. At home, Jamal was sitting on the couch, playing video games with his right arm carefully positioned on a pillow. His burns were healing well under Dr. Washington's care. The bandages were smaller now, and the pain was mostly gone. Marcus watched his son from the kitchen, thinking about all the changes that had come from that terrible Sunday afternoon. His phone buzzed with a message from Janet Morris. "Mr. Thompson, the board has voted unanimously to approve all proposed changes. We would like to invite you to serve as a founding member of our new Diversity and Inclusion Board. Your experience as both a parent and a civil rights attorney would be invaluable." Before Marcus could reply, another message came through, this one from the State Medical Board. They had scheduled Dr. Richards' license revocation hearing for the following week. The evidence was so overwhelming that they were fast-tracking the process. Mrs. Robinson stopped by to check on Jamal, as she had every day since the incident. When Marcus showed her the messages, she smiled. "Sometimes it takes one brave person standing up to change an entire system," she said, watching Jamal play his game. "Your son may not understand it now, but what happened to him is going to protect a lot of other children." Marcus nodded, looking again at the message from Janet Morris. Real change was happening, faster and more thoroughly than he had expected. Dr. Richards' actions had finally caught up with him, and an entire hospital system was being transformed as a result. The news of Dr. Wilkins' sudden and gruesome demise spread through the community like wildfire. Reactions were mixed, with some condemning the father's actions as a heinous crime, while others struggled to reconcile the tragedy with a deeper understanding of the systemic injustices that had led to this point. In the days that followed, the police launched a thorough investigation, determined to uncover the truth and bring the perpetrator to justice. Detectives combed through the hospital's security footage, interviewed staff members, and traced the father's movements on the night of the incident. However, the trail soon grew cold, as the distraught father had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the haunting memory of his son's suffering and his own desperate act of retribution. As the investigation stalled, the community found itself grappling with the complex layers of the tragedy. Some voiced their outrage, condemning the father's actions as a barbaric act of violence that could not be justified, no matter the circumstances. They'd argued that the justice system should have been allowed to run its course, even in the face of such blatant discrimination. Others, however, found themselves torn between sympathy for the father's anguish and a deep-seated understanding of the systemic racism that had led to his son's near-fatal neglect. They recalled the countless instances where black patients had been turned away or dismissed by medical professionals, their lives deemed less valuable than those of their white counterparts. The debate raged on, with each side entrenched in their respective positions, unwilling to find common ground. The hospital, too, found itself at the center of the controversy as the public scrutiny intensified. Calls for sweeping reforms and accountability echoed through the community, with many demanding that the institution address the underlying biases that had allowed such a tragedy to occur. In the midst of the turmoil, the family of the young burn victim struggled to come to terms with their loss. The mother, devastated by the tragic turn of events, withdrew from the public eye, her grief a heavy burden that she carried alone. The father, a fugitive from the law, was consumed by a sense of both guilt and righteous fury, unable to reconcile the decision that had irrevocably altered the course of their lives. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation languished, with no new leads to follow. The police, under intense pressure from the community and the media, were forced to concede that the father's whereabouts remained a mystery, his trail having gone cold. Meanwhile, the hospital's reputation lay in tatters, as the public's trust in the institution had been irreparably shattered. Administrators scrambled to implement new policies and diversity training, desperate to regain the community's confidence and prevent another such tragedy from occurring. Yet, for many, the damage had already been done. The memory of the young boy's suffering and the father's desperate act of vengeance had become a somber reminder of the deep-seated inequalities that continued to plague the healthcare system and society at large. In the end, the story of the racist doctor and the father's revenge became a cautionary tale, a tragic lesson in the consequences of unchecked prejudice and the enduring legacy of systemic racism. It was a tale that would continue to haunt the community, a stark reminder that the fight for true equality and justice was far from over. As the dust settled and the media's spotlight eventually shifted, the family's fate remained shrouded in mystery, their story fading into the annals of a troubled history, a testament to the pain and anguish that can arise when the very institutions meant to protect the vulnerable fail to uphold the most fundamental principles of humanity and compassion.